The Ireland of the 1840s was a land of stark, heartbreaking contrasts. To the absentee English landlord viewing his estate from the comfort of a London club, it was a verdant, fertile island, an emerald isle that provided a steady stream of agricultural wealth. But for the millions of Irish Catholic peasants who worked that land, it was a place of crushing poverty, political subjugation, and a fragile existence balanced on a single, precarious crop, the potato. This dependency was not an accident of nature, but the direct result of centuries of British colonial policy, a time bomb of social and economic injustice waiting for a catalyst. That catalyst arrived in the damp, cool summer of 1845, not with a bang, but with a silent, creeping rot. The relationship between Ireland and England was that of master and servant, a colony in all but name. Following the brutal conquests and penal laws of the 17th and 18th centuries, the native Irish population had been systematically dispossessed of their land. By the 19th century, most of Ireland was owned by around 10,000, mostly Protestant, often absentee landlords. The vast Catholic majority were reduced to tenant farmers, living at the mercy of these landlords, their rents often extortionate, their tenure insecure. A farmer could be evicted for the slightest complaint or for simply failing to pay rent after a bad harvest, a practice known as clearing estates. The potato was the only thing that made this system tenable. Introduced to Ireland in the late 16th century, the potato thrived in the Irish climate and soil, even on poor, small plots of land. An acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year, a nutritional yield unimaginable with grain crops. This efficiency allowed the population to soar from around 3 million in the mid-18th century to over 8 million by 1845. For the tenant farmer, a small plot, known as a conocra, could support a family, while the rest of their labor went towards producing grain or raising livestock to pay the rent to the landlord. This was the cruel irony of pre-famine Ireland. The island was a net exporter of food. Vast quantities of wheat, oats, barley, beef, and pork were shipped under armed guard from Irish ports to England, enough to feed the Irish population several times over. The peasantry watched this bounty sail away, while their own survival depended entirely on the potato patch behind their cottage.
In September 1845, the first reports began to trickle in from the fields. The potato plants, lush and green just weeks before, were turning black and withering into a foul-smelling slime. The tubers pulled from the ground were initially intact, but within days they transformed into a putrid, inedible mush. The cause was Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that causes late blight. The weather that year, unusually cool, wet, and overcast, provided the perfect conditions for the blight to spread like wildfire through the monoculture crop. The same damp air that fostered the blight carried its scent, a pervasive, sickly odor of decay that hung over the entire island, the first olfactory warning of the coming catastrophe. The initial reaction was one of concern, but not yet panic. Potato crop failures were not unknown in Ireland. There had been partial famines before, and the government had intervened with relief efforts. Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, recognizing the impending disaster, acted with uncharacteristic urgency. He secretly purchased 100,000 pounds worth of maize and cornmeal, dubbed Peel's brimstone by the Irish for its yellow color and difficult-to-digest nature, from America to be sold cheaply, and established a relief commission. He also made the controversial move of repealing the Corn Laws in 1846, tariffs that protected British grain producers in an effort to lower the price of food by allowing cheaper foreign grain into the UK. While well-intentioned, these measures were a drop in the ocean of need. The harvest of 1846 was awaited with desperate anxiety. Farmers had used their few healthy potatoes, or even the partially blighted ones, as seed. The result was a complete and utter catastrophe. The blight returned with a vengeance, destroying nearly the entire crop. This was the point when concern turned to terror. The food stores were now utterly depleted. The price of the few remaining potatoes skyrocketed. Peel's replacement, Lord John Russell of the Whig Party, was a devout believer in laissez-faire economics, the doctrine of non-interference in the market. He halted government food purchases, arguing that private merchants and market forces should address the shortage. He declared that the responsibility of relieving the misery must be left to the generosity of the landlords and the charity of the rich. It was a death sentence for millions. By the winter of 1846 into 1847, the Great Hunger began in earnest. The peasants had exhausted their resources. They sold their livestock, their tools, and their meager possessions to buy food and pay rent. When those were gone, they faced eviction. Landlords seeking to clear their estates of unprofitable tenants and convert the land to more lucrative pasture sent bailiffs and soldiers to tear down cottages with battering rams, leaving families to huddle in ditches in the dead of winter. The roads filled with spectral figures, families wandering without aim, begging for food, their clothes in rags, their eyes hollow with a hunger that no amount of Peel's brimstone could satisfy. The workhouses, designed to be the last resort for the destitute, became breeding grounds for disease. This was the beginning of the descent into hell. The year 1847 would become known as Black 47, the worst single year of the famine, a year when the very fabric of Irish society began to unravel under the weight of suffering so profound it would forever scar the national psyche.
The story of the Irish famine is one of the great tragedies of the 19th century, a collision of natural disaster and human failing that created an apocalyptic landscape. If you are drawn to the darkest chapters of history, to understanding how a nation can be brought to its knees, then you need to follow this story to its devastating conclusion. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. The worst is yet to come. The year 1847 dawned with a cold that seeped into the very bones of Ireland. It was not just the cold of winter, but the cold of emptiness, of despair. The public work schemes initiated by Peel, road building, and other make-work projects designed to provide men with wages to buy food were hopelessly inadequate. Hundreds of thousands of starving, weakened men labored with shovels and picks for a pittance, often collapsing and dying on the very roads they were building. The system was a cruel joke. The energy expended on the work burned more calories than the wages could purchase. With the complete failure of the potato crop for the second year running, the situation escalated from a crisis to a full-blown famine. The term hunger is too simple to describe the physiological and psychological torment that gripped the country. It began with a constant, gnawing pain in the stomach. Then came the weakness, the dizziness, the inability to concentrate on anything but food. The body began to consume itself, breaking down muscle tissue for energy. The victims, or victims of the famine as they were recorded, became living skeletons, their skin stretched taut over bone, their eyes sinking deep into their sockets. This state of emaciation was known as marasmus. But there was another, even more horrific form of starvation: hunger edema. The body, in its final, desperate stages, loses the ability to regulate fluids. Protein deficiency causes blood vessels to leak, leading to swelling. People would swell up with watery fluid, their limbs and bellies becoming grotesquely distended, while the rest of their body wasted away. This swelling was often a sign of imminent death. The sight of children with bloated stomachs and stick-like limbs became a common, haunting image of the famine. Disease followed hunger like a shadow. The body's immune system, weakened by starvation, was defenseless. Typhus, relapsing fever, and dysentery, diseases that became known as famine fevers, swept through the overcrowded workhouses, the miserable fever sheds set up haphazardly, and the roadside ditches where the evicted sought shelter.
Typhus, transmitted by lice, earned the name Black Fever for the dark rash that covered its victims, who often died delirious with fever. Dysentery, the flux, caused violent, bloody diarrhea, dehydrating and killing its victims, who had nothing left in their bodies to lose. It is here that the most enduring and chilling folkloric images of the famine were born: the silent villages and the ghosts with empty eyes. As disease and hunger ravaged a townland, entire families would succumb behind the closed doors of their cottages. Neighbors themselves, too weak or too terrified of infection, would be unable to help. A traveler passing through would be met with an eerie silence, broken only by the wind or the lowing of a lonely cow. Peering into the windows of a cabin, one might see the entire family dead inside, their bodies often lying where they fell for days or weeks. Their faces, in the final stages of starvation, were often described as mask-like, their eyes vacant and staring, devoid of the spark of life, the empty eyes that would stare out from the darkness of abandoned homes, forever burned into the memory of those who witnessed them. These ghosts were not supernatural. They were the very real, unburied dead. The sheer number of corpses overwhelmed the living. Coffins were a luxury no one could afford. Mass graves or pits were dug. There were accounts of bodies being carried to the graveyard on ladders, wrapped only in rags. In some places, corpse houses were set up where bodies were stored haphazardly until they could be disposed of. The psychological impact of this breakdown in the sacred duty of burial was profound. The ancient Irish tradition of the wake, a respectful farewell to the dead, was replaced by a frantic, terrified disposal of bodies. The response of the British government, guided by the rigid ideology of Lord John Russell and his Treasury official Charles Trevelyan, remained woefully inadequate. Trevelyan, who effectively administered the relief efforts, believed the famine was a mechanism of God to reduce Ireland's surplus population and teach the Irish a lesson in self-reliance. He famously wrote, "The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish lesson. That calamity must not be too much mitigated." The soup kitchens that were established in the summer of 1847, while providing 3 million rations a day, were a temporary measure and were shut down as soon as the harvest, which was again partial, came in. The export of food from Ireland continued unabated throughout the worst years of the famine. Armed guards escorted wagons of grain, beef, and pork to waiting ships in ports like Cork and Dublin, while the people who harvested that food starved in the ditches just miles away. This grotesque paradox became the central, burning injustice of the famine in the Irish memory. The food was there. It was being taken away. The people were not just starving, they were being starved.
The landscape itself transformed. The countryside, once dotted with the smoky roofs of small cottages, began to empty. The fields fell silent. The only signs of life were the scavenging animals and the ominous flocks of crows. The roads, however, were filled with a new kind of traffic, the desperate flow of humanity. Thousands abandoned their homes and took to the roads, becoming travelers in the most tragic sense, moving without purpose other than to find food or simply to move until they could move no more. They died on the roadsides, their bodies becoming landmarks for other travelers. This great disorganized migration was the prelude to a much larger, more permanent exodus, the flight from Ireland itself. As the hopelessness of their situation became undeniable, the Irish faced an impossible choice: certain death at home or a perilous journey towards the faint hope of survival abroad. This led to one of the most mass migrations in 19th century history, an exodus fueled not by ambition, but by sheer desperation. The journey itself became a further chapter in the saga of suffering, a brutal filter that would claim thousands more lives before a new shore was even sighted. The primary destinations were North America, the United States and Canada, and Britain. The ports of Dublin, Cork, Liverpool, and Belfast swarmed with emaciated, disease-ridden refugees clutching their few belongings and their tickets to an unknown future. These tickets were often purchased with the last of the family's money, sent by relatives who had emigrated earlier or obtained through a final, desperate sale of their land or cabin. The vessels that carried them across the Atlantic were infamous coffin ships. These were often old timber ships previously used in the slave trade or for transporting cargo, woefully unfit for human passengers. The regulations governing passenger vessels, the Passenger Acts, were weak and poorly enforced. Ship owners, seeing a chance for profit, packed hundreds of people into dark, airless holds between decks. The conditions on these ships were a microcosm of the hell they were leaving behind. Disease ran rampant. Typhus, dysentery, and ship's fever spread uncontrollably in the cramped, filthy quarters. Food and water were often scarce and rotten. The starving passengers, their constitutions already shattered, had little resistance to disease. Many died during the voyage. Their bodies were simply thrown overboard, committed to an anonymous Atlantic grave. The mortality rates on these ships were staggering. On some, a third or more of the passengers perished during the 6 to 8 week journey. Those bound for Canada, then British North America, faced a particularly grim reception. Ships arriving at Grosse Ile, the quarantine station on the St. Lawrence River near Quebec, presented scenes of utter horror. Officials reported ships drifting into port with the dead and dying lying together on the decks. In 1847 alone, over 100,000 immigrants arrived in Canada, and it is estimated that more than 20,000 died either during the voyage or in the quarantine hospitals on arrival. Grosse Ile became an island cemetery, a tragic Irish memorial on the banks of the St. Lawrence. Those who survived the journey faced new hardships. In the United States, they arrived sick and destitute, often viewed with suspicion and prejudice by the established Protestant population. Newspaper cartoons depicted them as brutish, ape-like creatures. Signs reading "No Irish Need Apply" appeared on shop windows and job advertisements. They were forced into the most dangerous, low-paying jobs, building canals, railroads, and living in overcrowded, disease-ridden slums in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Yet, despite this hostile reception, they clung to survival. They formed tight-knit communities, built powerful political machines, and through sheer force of numbers and will, began to carve out a place for themselves, forever changing the demographic and cultural landscape of America. Back in Ireland, the landscape was altered beyond recognition. The population plummeted. From a pre-famine high of over 8 million, it dropped to around 6 million by 1851 and continued to fall for decades due to continued emigration and a lowered birth rate. Whole villages and townlands disappeared, their stone cottages crumbling back into the earth, leaving behind only faint outlines in the grass, known today as famine villages. The Irish language, Gaelic, which was already in decline, suffered a catastrophic blow, as the famine had struck hardest in the poorer, Irish-speaking western regions. The psychological scar ran even deeper. A profound sense of loss, injustice, and grievance was seared into the national consciousness, a wound that would fuel Irish nationalism and anti-British sentiment for generations to come.
The famine officially ended around 1852 when the potato crop finally recovered, but its effects were permanent. The Ireland that emerged was a quieter, emptier, and profoundly traumatized country. The relationship with Britain was irreparably broken. The mass emigration established the Irish diaspora, which would shape countries across the globe. The folk memory of the ghosts with empty eyes and the silent villages became a powerful part of Irish cultural identity, a somber reminder of a time when the world had turned away and an entire people had been brought to the brink of annihilation. The echoes of Black 47 shaped the modern world, creating a global diaspora and a legacy of grief that still resonates today. If you are captivated by the intersection of history, tragedy, and the enduring human spirit, then our channel is your destination for these profound stories. Subscribe now and ring the bell for notifications. We are dedicated to uncovering the truths that define us. To understand the full horror of the Great Famine, one must look beyond the rotting potatoes and the emaciated bodies and examine the cold, bureaucratic machinery that allowed it to happen. The famine was not merely a natural disaster. It was a catastrophe enabled and exacerbated by a specific set of political ideologies, economic theories, and deeply ingrained prejudices that governed British policy in Ireland. At the heart of the failure was the doctrine of laissez-faire economics, championed by the Whig government of Lord John Russell. This philosophy held that the government should not interfere with the free market. In practice, this meant that while Ireland starved, the export of food to England continued unimpeded. It meant that the government was reluctant to establish a comprehensive system of food aid, fearing it would disrupt private trade and create a culture of dependency. This ideological rigidity blinded officials to the stark reality. The market was not functioning. The people had no money to be consumers in this free market, and the merchants had no incentive to feed them without profit. The man tasked with administering relief was Sir Charles Trevelyan, the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury. For Trevelyan, the famine was not just an economic problem to be solved, but a moral and theological one. A devout evangelical, he saw the blight as a divine intervention, a providential act meant to teach the Irish a lesson for what he perceived as their indolence, their over-reliance on the potato, and their perceived moral failings. His correspondence is filled with a chilling callousness. He argued that the famine was a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, and that the government's duty was not to solve the crisis, but to avoid interfering with the natural operation of this great check on the increase of the Irish population. This mindset transformed a humanitarian crisis into a Malthusian social experiment on a mass scale. The relief efforts that were attempted were often poorly conceived and humiliating. The public works schemes, where men broke stones and built roads that led nowhere, were designed to be so arduous that only the truly desperate would apply. The wages were pitifully low and often paid irregularly. The soup kitchens, though successful in feeding millions, were seen as a temporary stopgap and were closed down prematurely under the doctrine of least eligibility, the idea that conditions inside relief systems must be worse than the worst conditions outside to discourage people from relying on them. Furthermore, the British government continued to demand that Ireland finance its own relief through local taxes, a crushing burden on a country already spiraling into economic collapse. The infamous Gregory Clause, introduced in 1847, stipulated that any tenant holding more than a quarter acre of land would be ineligible for public assistance unless they surrendered their holding to their landlord. This clause effectively forced millions to choose between keeping their means of future survival, their land, or receiving immediate life-saving aid. It became a powerful tool for landlords to clear their estates of smallholders, leading to mass evictions. The role of the absentee landlords cannot be overstated. While some were benevolent and bankrupted themselves trying to help their tenants, many others were ruthless. Seeing the famine as an opportunity to switch from labor-intensive tillage to more profitable livestock raising, they embarked on a mass eviction campaign. Using the poor law system and the Gregory Clause, they ejected hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. Bailiffs, protected by large forces of police and soldiers, would arrive at a village, tear the roofs off the cabins with crowbars and battering rams, and render them uninhabitable. The images of these evictions, of women and children screaming as their homes were destroyed around them, became iconic symbols of British oppression. The media and popular opinion in Britain also played a role. Major newspapers like The Times of London often portrayed the Irish in racist and stereotypical terms, depicting them as lazy, ungrateful, and responsible for their own plight. Cartoons showed Paddy as a simian-like creature, content to sit back and expect the British taxpayer to feed him. This dehumanization made it easier for the political class and the public to accept a level of suffering in Ireland that would have been unthinkable in England or Scotland. The cumulative effect of these policies was not merely neglect, it was a form of structural violence. The resources to prevent mass starvation existed. The food was being produced in Ireland and shipped out. The financial means existed. The British Empire was the wealthiest global power of its age. The political will, however, was absent, replaced by a lethal combination of ideological dogma, racial prejudice, and a providential belief that the Irish were getting what they deserved. The famine, therefore, stands as a stark historical example of how a disaster can be transformed into a genocide by inaction when viewed through the lens of economic theory and cultural contempt.
The Great Famine did not end with the return of the potato crop. It simply transitioned from a period of acute physical suffering into a lasting state of cultural and psychological trauma. The event left a deep and permanent scar on the Irish landscape, the Irish language, and the Irish soul. Its memory was preserved not just in history books, but in the rich and somber tapestry of Irish folklore, in the silent ruins of abandoned villages, and in the political DNA of the Irish nation. The most immediate and visible legacy was the emptiness. Ireland became a country of ghosts. The population continued to decline for over a century after the famine due to sustained emigration. Walking through the countryside, one would encounter the eerie remains of famine villages, clusters of stone cottages with collapsed roofs, their walls slowly being reclaimed by grass and moss. These silent ruins served as constant mute memorials to the families who had once lived there, their stories lost to the wind. The practice of famine walls can also be found across Ireland. These were dry stone walls built for useless public works projects, snaking across barren landscapes, monuments to feudal labor. The Irish language, Gaelic, was dealt a near-fatal blow. The famine had hit the poorest, most rural, and most Irish-speaking areas of the West and South the hardest. Death and emigration decimated the Gaelic-speaking population. Furthermore, the language became associated with poverty and catastrophe. Parents desperate for their children to have a future often encouraged them to speak English, the language of opportunity and escape. Within a few generations, the number of native Irish speakers collapsed from several millions to a few 100,000, concentrated in small pockets called the Gaeltachtae. The folk memory of the famine is perhaps its most powerful legacy. In the absence of formal memorials for decades, the people kept the memory alive through stories, songs, and poems passed down through generations. This oral history is filled with haunting imagery that goes beyond the factual record into the realm of collective trauma. The phrase "ghosts with empty eyes" encapsulates this. It is less a literal description and more an evocation of the profound dehumanization and despair witnessed by survivors. Folk tales emerged of the Fíor Gorta, the man of hunger, a spectral, emaciated figure who would appear at the door begging for food. To give him food was to receive good fortune, to turn him away was to invite a curse. This figure can be interpreted as a personification of the famine itself, and a moral lesson on the duty of charity born from the collective guilt of those who had to refuse help to their starving neighbors. Other stories told of fairy forts and supernatural warnings, reflecting a world where the natural order had been so thoroughly upended that only otherworldly explanations could be found. Politically, the famine was a watershed moment.
It destroyed any remaining credibility of British rule in Ireland for the vast majority of the population. The failure of the government to protect its citizens was seen not as a mistake but as a deliberate act of genocide, a belief encapsulated in the Irish phrase an gcomhar tamór, the Great Hunger, implying an active force rather than a passive event. This bitterness fueled the radicalization of Irish politics, giving rise to the Fenian movement and later revolutionary groups like the IRA, for whom the famine was a foundational justification for armed struggle and complete independence. The diaspora, now tens of millions strong across the globe, also carries the memory. In America, Canada, Australia, and Britain, the descendants of famine immigrants often retained a strong sense of Irish identity, one shaped by the narrative of forced exile and survival. The famine became a cornerstone of Irish American identity, a story of overcoming prejudice and hardship. Today, the famine is officially remembered. Museums like the Irish National Famine Museum at Strokestown Park and the Jeanie Johnston Tall Ship in Dublin keep the history alive. Memorials now stand in cities across Ireland and the world. The years of silence have been broken, but the echoes of that silence remain. The Great Famine stands as one of the most devastating humanitarian crises of the modern era, a complex tragedy where nature, economics, politics, and prejudice combined to create a perfect storm of suffering. It is a story of a people abandoned, of a landscape emptied, and of a silence so profound that the ghosts, it is said, still whisper in the empty fields of Ireland.
The story of the Great Famine did not conclude in 1852. Its interpretation and the quest for a historical reckoning have continued for over a century and a half. The question of responsibility, of whether the famine was a tragedy, a disaster, or an act of genocide, remains a deeply contentious and emotionally charged issue, central to the relationship between Ireland and Britain and to our understanding of 19th century imperialism. In the immediate decades following the famine, a narrative of forgetfulness and silence descended upon Ireland. The trauma was so profound that survivors often refused to speak of it, a common psychological response to catastrophic events. The subject was too painful, too shameful. This silence was compounded by the political climate. Under continued British rule, a full-throated condemnation of government policy was difficult and dangerous. The official British historical view for many years minimized the disaster, often blaming the Irish themselves for their overpopulation and dependency on the potato. The watershed moment for famine memory began with the work of historians like Cecil Woodham Smith, whose 1962 book, The Great Hunger, was a landmark publication. Meticulously researched, it laid bare the horrifying details of the suffering and the devastating failures of the British government. It broke the long silence and sparked a new public and academic interest in the event. In Ireland, as the country gained full independence and found its voice, the famine was re-examined not as a natural disaster, but as a defining moment of national martyrdom. The debate over the term genocide is the most heated aspect of this reckoning. Historians are divided. Those who argue against the term point out that there was no deliberate, orchestrated plan by the British government to exterminate the Irish people. The policies were motivated by ideology, laissez-faire economics, neglect, and prejudice, rather than a specific intent to destroy. The outcome, while horrific, was an unintended consequence of these policies. However, other scholars and much of Irish popular memory argue that the term has validity under a broader definition. They point to the fact that the government, aware of the scale of the suffering, continued to pursue policies that knowingly exacerbated it. The export of food, the closure of soup kitchens, the enforcement of the Gregory Clause. These were conscious choices. When a government has the means to alleviate a famine affecting a subject population and deliberately chooses not to,
Citing racist ideology and economic theory, the line between neglect and a form of passive genocide becomes blurry. The term genocide by omission is often used. The comments of figures like Trevelyan, who saw the famine as a mechanism sent by God, suggest a chilling willingness to accept mass death as a solution to the Irish problem. In 1997, on the 150th anniversary of Black 47, British Prime Minister Tony Blair issued a statement. While stopped short of a full apology, he acknowledged that Britain had failed the Irish people. Those who governed in London at the time failed their people through standing by while a crop failure turned into a massive human tragedy, he said. This was a significant, if symbolic, moment of official recognition from the British state. The famine's legacy is also an economic one. It fundamentally altered the landholding system in Ireland, consolidating plots and pushing the country towards pasture-based agriculture. It set back Irish economic development by decades, creating a pattern of emigration that drained the country of its youth and vitality for generations. The psychological impact is immeasurable. It instilled a deep-seated fear of hunger and authority, a cultural memory of abandonment that influences Irish attitudes to this day. The Great Irish Famine remains a pivotal chapter in world history. It is a case study in the dangers of ideological fundamentalism, whether economic or religious. It is a lesson in how racial and cultural prejudices can blind governments to their humanitarian responsibilities. And it is a testament to the resilience of a people who, though scattered across the globe, carried with them the memory of those who were lost, ensuring that the ghosts of the famine would never be completely forgotten. The empty eyes still stare from the past, a silent accusation and a permanent warning.